Mind control effects, or, if you prefer, control magic effects, are one of the most powerful things in Magic. These are cards that let you gain control of an opposing creature permanently. When you gain control of a creature your opponent controls, it's like you are simultaneously removing it and creating a token copy of it, and that's an effect that drastically alters a game in your favor. While it's primarily a blue effect, it also shows up sometimes in black. It's been a prominent part of the blue color pie since day one, as Alpha's control magic was the first time we saw this type of effect. This actually isn't the first time I've taken a look at mind control effects. I did it the last time way back in November of 2017, and as you'd expect, the list has changed a lot over the last 7+ years, so it was time for an update. To be eligible for this list, a card has to let you permanently gain control of an opposing creature. This means threatened effects don't qualify for the list because they only steal a creature for a turn. I also excluded exchange effects like Oko's -5, as these are substantially different than mind control effects, as they require you to give your opponent something for you to get something in return, and I've also given exchange effects their own top 10. In all, there were 103 cards with an eligible effect, and we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8, like at a Pro Tour, is worth 2 points, and a second tier top 8, like at a regional championship, is worth 1 point. Before we get to the list proper, let's take a look at the cards that made the list in 2017, but didn't make it this time, starting with Exert Influence, which was at number 10 last time. For 4 generic and a blue, it's a sorcery that lets you gain control of a creature if its power is less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast Exert Influence. In other words, if you spend all 5 colors of mana, this can gain control of the widest swath of creatures because it can take creatures with power 5 or less. That does mean it takes some work to get the full potential out of this card, and there are certainly times where a creature with more than 5 power is what you really want to steal, and this can never pull that off. The good news is, the standard format it was part of might have just been the best mana for any standard format in history, thanks to the presence of both fetch lands and lands with dual basic land typing. This led to most control decks going 4 or more colors, so Exert Influence was often as good as it could possibly be. However, Exert Influence hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of Standard, and it took 28 points to make the list this time, so it isn't even close. Next, there's Keiga, the Tide Star, which was at number 9 last time. This legendary dragon costs 5 generic and a blue. It's a 5/5 with flying, and it mind controls a creature when it dies. This type of card is the ultimate lose-lose situation. You're staring down a big dragon that can kill you in a few turns, so you sort of have to kill it, but if you do, your opponent steals your best creature. This dilemma was even more painful back in 2005, when exile removal was much less commonplace in standard legal sets, and a 5/5 flying dragon was also a lot scarier. Keiga saw significant play in both block and standard, but doesn't have any top 8 since 2006. Next, there's Control Magic, which was at number 8 last time. This is the original mind control effect, as I noted in the introduction, so it's kind of interesting that we don't call these control magic effects. Usually when we give an effect a nickname, it's the name of the original card that had the effect. I think the main reason we don't call them control magic effects is because that name doesn't really evoke what this kind of card does, and mind control does so more effectively. Like if you say, I'm going to mind control your creature, even someone who has never seen a mind control effect knows exactly what you mean, but if you say, I'm going to control magic your creature, they'll have no idea what you mean. Anyway, it's 2 generic and 2 blue for an enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it lets you steal the enchanted creature. This is a very efficient rate for stealing a creature, although putting the effect on an aura does open you up to lots of risks, since if your opponent destroys the aura, it can produce a blowout. From the beginning, it was clear to Magic players that this type of effect was very strong, so it's not too surprising that the first and second place decks at the very first World Championship were both packing Control Magic. It also saw some significant play in Extended, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 1997. Lastly, there's Gilded Drake, which is at number 6 last time. It not being on the list this time is different from the other 3 cards we saw. It would have still made the list this time, but in retrospect, I don't think it should have been on the list at all in 2017, so I pulled it off of the list this time. This is because it's more of an exchange effect than a mind control effect. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 3/3 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exchange control of it and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. It gets sacrificed if you don't make an exchange. So yeah, I'm not sure what past me was thinking putting this on the list back in 2017. While it's true that it's a more self-contained exchange effect than most of them, it's still an exchange. Obviously this is a weird card, so it didn't see any play while it was in standard, but it did see a lot of play in extended sideboards. It was mostly relegated to sideboards because of the fact that a card like this isn't going to be good against aggro decks. Generally, you're going to be getting a worse creature than the Drake. However, it is great against decks that go with big creatures. It saw some main deck play as a one-of in Extended, where it could be tutored up by survival of the fittest in situations where it was useful. It didn't see any play between 2005 and 2012, but then in 2012 it had a resurgence in Legacy, where it is particularly powerful against decks that like to cheat creatures into play with reanimation or show and tell, since now you get their Gristlebrand in exchange for the 3/3. So Gilded Drake is going to keep on putting up top 8s in Legacy, but that only matters for other top 10s and not this one. Alright, now that we've covered those 4 cards, let's move to the list proper, starting with Domestication, which was at number 7 last time. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's an enchantment aura with enchant creature, and you gain control of the enchanted creature. At the beginning of your end step, if the enchanted creature's power is 4 or greater, you sacrifice Domestication. So it's actually a powered down control magic, since it costs the same, but it can only temporarily give you control of a big creature. But even powered down, this type of effect is pretty strong. And that was especially true in the format it was part of. It was exclusively featured in standard devotion to blue decks. These decks liked that Domestication gave them a devotion bump, and if you happen to steal a blue creature, it might even give you a huge one. It hasn't put up any top 8 since 2014 though, and it just barely managed to hold on to a spot on the list. At number 9, it's Emrakul the World Anew. A newcomer to the list, Emrakul was printed in 2024's Modern Horizons 3. For 12 generic mana, she's a legendary 12/12 Eldrazi, and her cast trigger is what makes her eligible for the list, because it's the most powerful mind control effect possible. It lets you gain control of all creatures target player controls. So it's a mass mind control effect. She's an absurd Eldrazi, of course, so things don't end there. Emrakul the World Anew also has flying, protection from spells and permanents that were cast this turn, and madness for 6 colorless mana. Madness means if you discard her, you can pay that alternate casting cost to cast her, so you can potentially pay only 6 for this absurd effect, and also potentially at instant speed. There is one sort of downside though. When she leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice all of your creatures. That includes the ones that you mind controlled, but hey, at least it's better than giving them back to your opponent. Because she's from Modern Horizons 3, the only 60-card formats she's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but even with that restriction, she's been pretty successful since being printed, especially in Modern, where she quickly found a home in Eldrazi Tron decks. These decks combine the powerful Urza lands and the Eldrazi ramp lands like Eldrazi Temple to cast powerful Eldrazi way ahead of schedule. Between those amazing colorless lands and a discard outlet like the Underworld Cookbook, it's possible to cast Emrakul the World Anew as early as turn 3. She's also seen a bit of play in Legacy, where she appears in the similar Cloud Post deck, which uses the Post and other Locust lands to produce lots of mana. Emrakul the World Anew is going to keep on stealing creatures in bunches, especially in Modern. At number 8, it's Entrancing Melody, another newcomer to the list. It did exist back in 2017, but it had only been printed 2 months before I did that top 10, and it didn't start seeing play until 2018. It's a sorcery, and for X and 2 blue, it lets you mind control a creature with a mana value of X. So while it's expensive to take something with a high mana value, it's also incredibly cheap to take smaller creatures. And really, the creatures aren't always small, since some low mana value creatures can be super scary. Stealing a token will only cost you 2 mana, for example. This has led to the Melody seeing play in multiple formats over the years. It was pretty successful in Standard, but it's been played in other formats too. After all, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy have even more super powerful cheap creatures for you to steal efficiently. Taking a Merit Lage token for only 2 mana is probably the sweetest thing you can do. However, the Melody hasn't put up any top 8 since 2023. At number 7, it's Dragonlord Silumgar, which was at number 3 last time. For 4 generic, a blue, and a black, it's a 3/5 flying legendary dragon with Death Touch, and when it enters, you can mind control a creature or a planeswalker, and you maintain control of it as long as you control Dragonlord Silumgar. Attaching a mind control effect to a creature can be a bit of a double-edged sword. It definitely feels absurd to add this big Death Touch body to the board and steal your opponent's best creature or planeswalker at the same time, but because Silumgar can only control that card as long as it sticks around, your opponent does have an avenue to get their creature or planeswalker back. The Dragonlord was commonly played in control decks when it was in Standard, and it was extra good in Dragon control decks, which could get extra value out of having dragons in their deck, most notably with Silumgar's Scorn, which was frequently just straight up counterspell in the deck. While stealing creatures with it was great, it was also super well positioned against the best planeswalker and one of the best cards overall in that Standard format, who you would play against all the time, Gideon, ally of Zendikar. Typically, people played Gideon and just spit out 2/2 tokens with him, which means his loyalty was usually at 4, and he just so happens to have an ultimate that is a -4, so stealing Gideon and popping off his ultimate to get that emblem for yourself was a pretty common play pattern. It also meant that they'd never get Gideon back. It hasn't seen very much success over the last several years though, with only a single Pioneer top 8, and it doesn't have a top 8 in any format since 2020. At number 6, it's Agent of Treachery, a newcomer to the list that got printed in 2019. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a 2/3, and when it enters, you gain control of target permanent. So, this is the most flexible mind control we've seen so far, since it can take any permanent. The agent also loves it when you steal multiple permanents, because at the beginning of your end step, it draws you 3 cards if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own. Notably, the agent's steal effect does not stop once it leaves the battlefield. So the agent does cost 7 mana, which is certainly a hurdle, kind of. You see, the thing is that decks that have played the agent have found ways to put it into play without really having to spend any mana, and as you'd expect, that's completely absurd. Especially in Standard, where it was far too easy to pull off. You could even do it in 2 different decks. One of those ways was alongside Wynota, Joiner of Forces, who can put powerful humans into play for no mana. Whenever you attack with a non-human, you look at your top 6 cards, reveal a human, and put into play tapped, attacking, and indestructible until end of turn. Agent of Treachery was pretty much the best hit off of that trigger, and getting the trigger going was way too easy. It wasn't hard to have a mix of non-humans and humans. You just had to run token generators that made non-human tokens, and then have your deck be loaded with powerful humans, and usually you'd get the trigger the turn Wynota came down, and she even triggers for each non-human attacker. You could also combine the agent with Luca, Coppercoat Outcast. He has a -2 that lets you exile a creature and then reveal cards from the top of your library until you had a creature with a higher mana value, and then you put that creature on the battlefield. Similar to Wynota decks, these decks ran lots of token generators, and in this case the only actual creature card in the whole deck was the agent, so the -2 always got you one. Mix in the fact that these decks also had ways to blink your creatures like a Yorion Companion, and you could even get to the point where Agent of Treachery was drawing you extra cards. Ultimately, these 2 separate Agent of Treachery combos got the card banned in Standard. Wynota also got banned in Pioneer, preventing the 2 from ever teaming up there. These days, the agent sees play in Pioneer Enigmatic Incarnation decks, which use that enchantment to tutor up powerful creatures, and they can even get them into play ahead of schedule thanks to the printing of the Overlords, which you can impend for very little mana, but when you sacrifice them to the Incarnation, they have their high mana values, so getting an agent into play isn't too difficult. The agent is likely to continue to put up top 8s in Pioneer going forward, and it will likely claim a higher spot on this list in the future. At number 5, it's Vedalken Shackles, which was also at number 5 last time. For 3 generic mana, it's an artifact that you can choose not to untap during your untap step, and you can pay 2 generic and tap it to gain control of target creature with power less than or equal to the number of islands you control for as long as the shackles remain tapped. Vedalken Shackles can steal creatures really efficiently and at instant speed, which means just the threat of using it can be a complete nightmare for your opponent. The downside is that you've got to be a very blue deck to really get the most out of the Shackles, but there have been decks over the years that were willing to go that route anyway, and playing the Shackles was just a bonus. For example, Fairy decks used it in Extended and Modern, and more recently it's been played in blue spell decks in Modern, as well as blue moon decks, prison decks that can lock the opponent out of the game and then steal the opponent's best creature to win. It's even been good enough for Legacy and Vintage in the past, and it's still putting up points, especially in Modern. At number 4, it's Confiscation Coup, which was also at number 4 last time. For 3 generic and 2 blue, it's a sorcery that has you choose target artifact or creature, and then you gain 4 energy, and you can pay an amount of energy equal to that permanent's mana value, and if you do, you gain control of it. So on its own, the Coup can take artifact creatures with a mana value of up to 4, and if you play this card in a deck that can make extra energy, the Coup can take almost any artifact or creature. Sometimes you can take something cheaper and hold on to your energy to use on something else too. In Kaladesh Standard, there were plenty of great ways to generate and spend energy, so Confiscation Coup had a ready-made home in the format. While it has gained an additional 17 points since 2017, that's just because it was still in Standard for a year, and since rotating out of the format it hasn't been able to find a new home, and Vedalken Shackles and Agent of Treachery will inevitably pass it. At number 3, it is Archmage's Charm, which is a newcomer to the list. For 3 blue mana, it's an instant, and like all charms, it gives you an option between 3 effects. In this case, you can counter a spell, have target player draw 2 cards, or, and this is the mode that qualifies it for this list, you can gain control of target non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. I did consider whether or not I wanted to include this on the list because it is but one mode on the card and it's a fairly restrictive mind control effect. Well, restrictive in terms of mana value, not so restricted in terms of card types. Ultimately though, I think that third mode is a big part of what makes Archmage's Charm as good as it is, so I decided to include it. The Charm is from a Modern Horizons set, so the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but that's okay because those are formats where that third option is especially devastating. I've already mentioned taking Merit Lage tokens in this video, but there are also lots of other great things it can take, like a Batterskull Germ token. It's worth noting that your opponent will maintain control over the equipment, but you disrupt them in a big way for a turn, and a turn is sometimes all you need in those formats. You can also go after Hanger Backwalker and similar permanents with a mana value of 0. The Charm can even steal stuff at instant speed, allowing for blowouts from time to time, and the great thing is, because it is modal, you can also just cast it as Divination or as a bad counterspell when those modes are more relevant. The Charm is going to continue to put up top 8s in all 3 formats, it's legal in, and it has a very good chance at one day being the number 1 card on the list. For now though, it's number 3, and the number 2 card is Sower of Temptation, which was dethroned from the number 1 spot on the list. For 2 generic and 2 blue, it's a 2/2 with flying, and when it enters, you gain control of a creature as long as the Sower remains on the battlefield. Basically, it's a smaller, cheaper Dragonlord Silumgar that can't steal planeswalkers. And while the Dragonlord's creature type was useful during its heyday, that was even more the case for the Sower because fairy decks were running wild in Block, Standard, Extended, and later Modern, and in those decks, this creature's type line was a huge deal. That meant it could also make your Spell Stutter Sprites and Scions of Una even better, and both of those cards could protect the Sower to make it harder for your opponent to ever get their creature back. It was played outside of fairy decks in multiple formats too, in decks like Cobblade in Standard and Toolbox decks in Modern. It's only managed to put up a single point in the time since the last list, and that one point came in a Vintage sideboard, and that's why it was surpassed by the number 1 card on the list, which is Threads of Disloyalty. For 1 generic and 2 blue, this is an aura with enchant creature with mana value 2 or less, and you gain control of that creature. So this is somewhat restrictive in what it can steal, but 3 mana to steal a creature is still an incredible deal. This has been especially true in formats with powerful creatures who have low mana values. For example, in Modern, it was frequently used to steal Tarmogoyf and Young Pyromancer. However, it has fallen off a lot in recent years as there are more and more super cheap creatures that don't have a low mana value despite being easy to cast, like Murktide Regent and Scion of Draco. Threads just doesn't have enough good targets these days to see as much play as it used to, and while it has gained 18 points over the last 7 years, it's only gained 2 since 2021, and it's probably going to continue to fade with time. So, those are the best ways to steal your opponent's creature in Magic. If you want to steal your opponent's creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.